Fear thrives in the unknown. It lurks in the shadowed corners of history, feeding on unanswered questions and lingering doubts. Some crimes fade into obscurity, their mysteries forgotten with time. But some remain etched in our collective psyche, haunting us with the sheer weight of their obscurity. For over a century, one man has embodied this terror, a specter of Victorian London, a phantom who walked the gaslit alleys and left behind a legacy of blood and whispers. Jack the Ripper. His identity remains a question with no answer. His motive, a puzzle without a solution. A killer without a name, roaming a city on the brink of modernity, his crimes serving as both an echo of the past and a warning to the future.
Welcome to Down the Crooked Path. I'm your host, Amanda Joy. Join me as we dive into eerie and spine-chilling stories that blur the lines between reality and the unknown. From cryptids and mysterious disappearances to true crime, UFO sightings, and paranormal activity. Venture into the unknown and uncover the secrets that lie down the crooked path.
Today, we unravel the fog-crowded streets of Whitechapel, tracing the footsteps of an infamous murderer who turned fear into legend. How much do we truly know about Jack the Ripper, and how much is simply myth, molded by time, speculation, and the human need to make sense of the senseless? Whitechapel, in 1888, was a place of stark contrast, where the wealthy and the poverty existed side by side, yet rarely intersected. The East End of London was notorious for its overcrowded streets, where thousands of people crammed into dilapidated housing, struggling to survive in conditions that bred disease, crime, and despair. The air was thick with coal smoke and the stench of unwashed bodies. Rotting refuse and open sewage filled the alleyways. Many families lived in single-room dwellings, packed together with little privacy, while others sought shelter in workhouses or on the streets. The divide between rich and poor was glaring. Just beyond Whitechapel's border, the affluent enjoyed grand homes, fine dining, and the luxuries of Victorian society. Meanwhile, in the East End, survival was a daily battle. Work was scarce and often unreliable. Many labored at sweatshops, toiled in the docks, and resorted to prostitution to make ends meet. Alcoholism was rampant, and crime flourished in the shadows of the gaslit streets. The police struggled to maintain order, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of poverty-driven violence. Despite misery, Whitechapel was alive with resilience. Immigrants, particularly Jewish refugees fleeing persecution, sought new beginnings here, bringing with them culture, trade, and community. But the harsh realities of life in Whitechapel made it a breeding ground for desperation. And when Jack the Ripper struck, the murders only heightened the fear and instability that had long plagued the district. The crimes exposed the brutal conditions of the East End to the wider world, forcing Victorian societies to confront the suffering it had long ignored. In the early hours of August 31st, 1888, the body of Ann Nichols was discovered in Box Row, Whitechapel, a narrow and dimly lit street lined with warehouses and tenements. It was approximately 3:40 a.m. when Constable John Neal, patrolling his beat, stumbled upon the gruesome scene. In the faint glow of a nearby gas lamp, he saw a figure laying on the ground near a stable entrance. At first he thought she was simply unconscious or drunk, a common sight in the impoverished East End. But as he stepped closer, the horror of what had happened became unmistakable. Nichols laid on her back, her skirt pulled up to her waist. Her throat had been slashed deeply, nearly severing her head, and her abdomen bore multiple brutal incisions. Blood pooled beneath her. The wounds appeared oddly clean, suggesting that they had been inflicted with precision. Her eyes were open, staring blankly into the night, and her hands were cold to the touch. Neil immediately summoned assistance, calling over Constable Thane and Mezen, who helped assess the scene. Shortly after, Dr. Henry Llewellyn arrived to examine the body. He estimated that Nichols had been dead for no more than 30 minutes, meaning that the killer had likely fled just before Neil's arrival. Despite the severity of the injuries, there was little blood splatter, leading investigators to believe that she had been murdered elsewhere and then moved, or that the killer had been disturbingly methodical in his attack. Nichols was soon transported to the Whitechapel mortuary, where further examination revealed the extent of her wounds. The brutality of the crime sent shockwaves through the community. The press quickly seized upon the story, fueling public fear and speculation. The murder of Mary Ann Nichols marked the beginning of what would become known as the Jack the Ripper killings, a series of gruesome murders that would terrorize London and leave investigators grasping for answers. The aftermath of Nichols' murder was immediate and intense. The police launched an investigation, questioning locals and searching for witnesses. Yet, as with the cases that would follow, no clear suspect emerged. The streets of Whitechapel, already plagued by poverty and crime, now carried an even deeper sense of dread. Women, especially those forced into prostitution, feared for their lives. And as the days passed, the realization set in. This was only the beginning. Nichols' death was the first of the canonical 5 victims attributed to Jack the Ripper, and her murder set the tone for the terrifying spree that would unfold in the weeks to come. Before the name Jack the Ripper became infamous, Whitechapel's prostitutes spoke of a menacing figure known as Leather Apron, a shadowy presence who prowled the streets, intimidating women with threats and violence. His name struck fear among those who worked in the dimly lit alleys, and when Annie Chapman was found murdered on September 8, 1888, many believed he was responsible. It was just before 6 a.m. when John Davis, a resident of 29 Hanbury Street, stepped into the backyard and was met with a sight so horrifying that he ran into the streets calling for help. Chapman lay between the steps and the wooden fence, her throat slashed deeply, her abdomen brutally mutilated, and her organs removed with disturbing precision. Her clothes were piled up, exposing her stockings. Her face and hands were covered in blood, and her fingers were curled as if she had fought against her attacker. A handkerchief was still tied around her throat, leading some to speculate that she had been wearing it when her killer struck. 2 workmen, James Kent and Henry Holland, responded to Davis's cries and rushed to find a policeman. Meanwhile, Davis ran to the Commercial Street Police Station, demanding immediate assistance. Inspector Joseph Chandler arrived on the scene, ordering the area to be cleared of onlookers. Dr. George Bigster Phillips, a divisional police surgeon, examined the body, confirming the grueling extent of the injuries. The murder of Annie Chapman sent shockwaves through Whitechapel. The press seized upon the story. The Star newspaper fueled public fear by publishing accounts of Leather Apron, the sinister figure who had been long terrorizing local women. The article described him as a violent extortionist, known for preying on prostitutes and demanding money under threat of harm. Many believed that he had finally escalated to murder. The police scrambled to track down Leather Apron, eventually identifying him as John Pizzer, a Jewish bootmaker. Pizzer was swiftly arrested, but his alibi proved solid. He had not been near Hanbury Street at the time of Chapman's murder. Though he was cleared of suspicion, the fear surrounding Leather Apron remained, and the East End embraced itself for even more violence. Chapman's murder intensified the urgency of the investigation, but as with Mary Ann Nichols, no clear suspect emerged. The streets of Whitechapel, already plagued by poverty, now carried an even deeper sense of dread. Women feared for their lives, and the city braced itself for what had to come. The nightmare was far from over. As fear gripped Whitechapel and frustration with police grew, George Lusk, a local builder and chairman of the Mile End Vigilance Committee, stepped forward to take action. On September 10, 1888, Lusk and a group of local businessmen and tradesmen organized the committee to aid in the search for the murderer terrorizing the East End. Concerned that law enforcement was failing to protect the residents, the committee hired private patrols to walk the streets at night, armed with whistles and wooden clubs, hoping to further deter attacks. In addition to nightly organized patrols, Lusk and his committee pushed for greater police presence and rewards for information leading to an arrest. Their efforts reflected the desperation of the Whitechapel community, which felt abandoned by authorities as the murders continued. Despite their determination, the killer had remained elusive, and tension in the East End only worsened as September wore on. On September 27th of 1888, the Central News Agency in London received a chilling letter. Later, it would be known as the Dear Boss letter. Written in red ink, the letter was addressed to the boss and contained taunting remarks about the ongoing police investigation. The author mocked law enforcement, claiming that they were nowhere close to catching him, and referenced the earlier panic surrounding Leather Apron, stating that the rumors had given him real fits. Most disturbingly, the letter promised further violence. The writer boasted about his previous murders and declared that he would clip the lady's ear off and send it to police officers, just for jolly. Signed, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. This was the first time the infamous name appeared in connection with the Whitechapel murders. Initially, authorities dismissed the letter as a hoax, believing it to be one of the many false claims sent by attention seekers. However, when the media published the full contents, the name Jack the Ripper spread through London like wildfire. The fear already present in Whitechapel now had a symbol, a name that carried the weight of the brutality, mystery, and terror. The press sensationalized the letter, fueling widespread speculation about the killer's identity. Public paranoia intensified, and prostitutes already living in fear now wondered if the murderer was watching them from the shadows, eager to fulfill his threats. Meanwhile, the Mile End Vigilance Committee, led by George Lusk, pushed authorities to take more aggressive action. With tensions rising, the police reviewed the letter carefully, debating whether the writer was truly the murderer or simply someone reveling in the chaos. As September neared its end, investigators and public alike braced for what might come next. In the early hours of September 30th, 1888, the body of Elizabeth Stride was discovered in Dutfield's yard off of Burner Street, Whitechapel. It was just after 1 a.m. when Louis Dimschitz, a costermonger returning home with his cart, entered the yard and noticed his pony shying away from something on the ground. Straining to see in the darkness, he struck a match, revealing the lifeless form of a woman laying near the entrance. Stride's body was positioned on its left side, her head turned towards the wall. Her throat had been slashed, but unlike previous victims, there was no additional mutilations, leading some to speculate that the killer had been interrupted before completing his gruesome work. Blood pooled beneath her, still fresh, suggesting that the murder had occurred mere minutes before discovery. Dipshits, unsure whether the woman was dead or simply unconscious, rushed inside the International Working Men's Club, which was adjacent the yard, to summon help. Several club members followed him back outside, and upon closer inspection, the grim reality became clear. Morris Eagle, another club member, ran to find a policeman, eventually alerting P.C. Henry Lamb, who arrived at the scene shortly after. The crime scene itself was cramped and enclosed, with wooden gates leading into the yard. The area was dimly lit, making visibility poor, and the proximity to the club meant that music and voices had filled the air just moments before the murder. The presence of a small pack of breath fresheners in Stride's hands suggested that she had been caught off guard, possibly mid-conversation with her killer. Dr. Frederick Blackwell arrived at 1:16 a.m. to examine the body, confirming that Stride had been dead no more than 30 minutes. The lack of further injuries led investigators to theorize that the murderer had been interrupted, possibly by Dipshit's arrival. Stride's murder was the first of two that night, marking what would later be known as the double event. But at this moment, the police were left with yet another brutal killing, and Whitechapel's fear deepened as realization set in. The killer was still out there. Later, that same evening, at 1:45 a.m., P.C. Edward Watkins, a constable of the City of London Police, was making his routine patrol through Mitre Square, a quiet and dimly lit corner of the city. As he turned into the square, his lantern illuminated a horrifying sight. The mutilated body of Catherine Eddowes laying in the darkest part of the square. Eddowes was positioned on her back, her clothes pulled up to her waist, exposing her body. Her throat had been deeply cut, severing her windpipe and major blood vessels, ensuring instant death. But the brutality didn't stop there. Her abdomen had been slashed open, and her intestines had been pulled out and placed over her right shoulder. Her face bore deliberate incisions, including cuts across her cheeks and eyelids, as if the killer had taken time to disfigure her features. Most disturbingly, her left kidney and uterus had been removed, suggesting a level of anatomical knowledge. Shocked by the gruesome scene, P.C. Watkins immediately ran to Cleary and Tongue, a warehouse where he knew George Morris, a retired police officer working as a night watchman, and he was stationed that evening. Bursting through the door, Watkins shouted, "For God's sake, mate, come to my assistant. Here is another woman cut to pieces." Morris grabbed his lamp and followed Watkins back to the square. Upon seeing the body, he wasted no time. He ran towards Aldgate, blowing his whistle furiously to summon more officers. Within minutes, P.C. James Harvey and P.C. Holland arrived, followed by Dr. George William Sakura, who was called from nearby Jewers Street. Sakura examined the body and later testified that the murder had likely occurred within minutes of discovery, meaning the killer had just fled the scene. He noted that the location was one of the darkest parts of Mitre Square, but that there was just enough light for the murderer to carry out his gruesome work. Shortly after, Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown, the City Police Division surgeon, arrived to conduct a more thorough examination. Brown noted that the precision of the organ removal suggested that the killer had some anatomical knowledge, though not necessarily that of a trained surgeon. He also observed that, despite extensive mutilations, there was little blood splatter, indicating that the killer had worked carefully and methodically. As the investigation unfolded, Inspector Edward Collard arrived from Bishopgate Police Station and ordered an immediate search of the surrounding area. Officers conducted door-to-door inquiries, questioning residents and searching for witnesses. Soon after, Superintendent James McWilliam, head of the City Police Detective Department, arrived with a team of detectives. He dispatched officers into battlefields, instructing them to search lodging houses and question suspicious individuals. Despite the sweeping response, the killer had vanished into the night, leaving behind only terror and speculation. The City of London Police, known for their more structured and disciplined approach, now joined the hunt alongside the Metropolitan Police, marking a significant shift in the investigation. Despite the swift response, the killer had vanished into the night, leaving behind terror and speculation. The City of London Police, known for its more structured and disciplined approach, now joined the hunt alongside the Metropolitan Police, marking a shift in the investigation. The murder of Catherine Eddowes, occurring just 45 minutes after the killing of Elizabeth Stride, cemented the night as the double event. The realization that the killer had struck twice in one night sent shockwaves through London. On October 1st, 1888, the Central News Agency received the Saucy Jack postcard, written in red pencil and signed Jack the Ripper. It referenced the double event, claiming, "Number 1 squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off, had not time to get ears off for police." Published immediately, the postcard fueled fear and speculation. Some believed it was genuinely from the killer due to its mention of the two murders before all the details were widely reported. Others suspected a journalistic hoax meant to sensationalize the case. Following this, on October 16th, George Lusk received a package that would become one of the most infamous pieces of correspondence in the Jack the Ripper case. The letter from hell. Unlike previous letters sent to the press, this one was delivered directly to Lusk's home, accompanied by a small box containing a preserved human kidney. The letter itself was written in crude, almost illiterate handwriting, setting it apart from the more polished Dear Boss and Saucy Jack letters. It read,
"Mr. Lusk, sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman and preserved it for you. The other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch Me When You Can."
The gruesome claim of cannibalism horrified Lusk and his committee members. Unsure whether the kidney was real, they sought medical examination. Dr. Thomas Openshaw, a pathologist at the London Hospital, analyzed the organ and determined that it belonged to an adult who had suffered from Bright's disease, a condition affecting the kidneys. This detail was significant because Catherine Eddowes, murdered on September 30th, had been found missing a kidney, and her medical history suggested that she had suffered from the same disease. The police debated the authenticity of the letter, some believing it was a genuine message from the killer, while others speculated it was a morbid hoax designed to further terrorize the public. Unlike the previous letters, the From Hell letter did not use the same Jack the Ripper, adding to the mystery surrounding its origins. The arrival of the letter deepened the fear gripping Whitechapel. The press sensationalized the story, and the idea that the killer was taunting investigators with body parts only heightened the hysteria. Lusk, already a vocal critic of the police response, became even more determined to push for stronger action. Despite the chilling nature of the letter, no new leads emerged, and the killer remained elusive. The letter from hell remains one of the most debated pieces of evidence in this case, with historians still questioning whether it was truly written by Jack the Ripper or some elaborate hoax meant to stoke fear. On the morning of November 9th, 1888, the most gruesome of the Jack the Ripper murders was discovered at 13 Miller Court. The victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was found brutally mutilated inside her small, sparsely furnished room, her murder marking the final and most savage killing attributed to the Ripper. At 10:45 a.m., Thomas Bowery, an assistant to John McCarthy, Kelly's landlord, was sent to collect overdue rent. When repeated knocks at her door went unanswered, Bowery stepped into the window, where the broken pane allowed him to peer inside. What he saw sent him staggering back in horror. He rushed to McCarthy's shop, breathlessly exclaiming, "Governor, I knocked at the door and couldn't make anyone answer. I looked through the window and saw lots of blood." McCarthy hurried to Miller Court, pushed aside the curtain covering the window, and was met with a sight so horrific that he would later describe it as more like the work of a devil than a man. Kelly's body lay on the bed, barely recognizable as human. Her face had been completely mutilated, her throat slashed down to the spine, and her abdomen eviscerated. Her breasts had been removed, and the flesh from her thighs had been cut away. The wall behind the bed was splattered with blood, and on the bedside table lay a pile of human flesh, further emphasizing the sheer brutality of the crime. McCarthy sent Bowery to Commercial Street Police Station, where Inspector Walter Dew and Walter Beck were on duty. Bowery, ashen-faced and barely able to speak, stammered out something about "another one, Jack the Ripper. Awful." Dew and Beck immediately followed him to Miller's Court, where they confirmed the horrific extent of the mutilations. Shortly after, Dr. Thomas Bond, the police surgeon, arrived to examine the body. His report detailed the extensive injuries, noting that Kelly's heart had been removed and was missing from the crime scene. Unlike the previous victims, Kelly had been murdered indoors, giving the killer ample time to carry out his gruesome work without fear of interruption. Bond estimated that the murder had occurred between 2 and 3 a.m., meaning that Kelly had been dead for several hours before her body was discovered. The police investigation was hindered by the lack of witnesses. Unlike the previous murders which had taken place in the streets, Kelly's killing occurred in the privacy of her room. Neighbors noted hearing faint cries of "murder" around 4 a.m., but such cries were common in the area and often ignored. Kelly's murder was widely reported in London. The sheer brutality of the crime led many to believe that the killer had escalated his violence, possibly signaling the end of his spree. The press also sensationalized this case. Despite the intensive investigation, no new leads emerged from this either, and Kelly's murder remained the final confirmed killing attributed to Jack the Ripper. Her tragic fate continues to be studied and debated and remembered as one of the most horrific crimes in history. While the 5 canonical victims, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, are widely accepted as the true victims of Jack the Ripper, several other women were murdered in Whitechapel around the same time. Their deaths led to speculations that the killer may have had more victims, though they were ultimately ruled out for various reasons. Among them were Martha Chapman, Rose Millett, and Alice Mackenzie, each of whom met a violent end in the East End of London. Martha Chapman is often debated as a potential first victim of Jack the Ripper. She was found murdered on August 7, 1888, in George Yard Buildings, Whitechapel. Her body bore 39 stab wounds, a level of brutality that led some investigators to suspect she was killed by the same hand that later murdered the Canonical Five. However, there were key differences. Her throat was not slashed, and her wounds appeared to have been inflicted with a small blade rather than a large knife used in later Ripper murders. Some theorists believe that her murder was the work of a soldier, as she was last seen with two men in military uniforms. Despite the savagery of the attack, the police ultimately did not link her conclusively to the Ripper. Rose Mylett was found dead in Clark's Yard Poplar on December 20th, 1888. Unlike the other victims, she showed no signs of mutilation. Her cause of death was strangulation, leading the police to suspect she had been murdered by a different killer. Initially, authorities believed she had died from natural causes or accidental suffocation, but post-mortem revealed marks around her neck confirming foul play. Some theorists argue that Jack the Ripper may have changed his method, but most experts dismiss this idea by the signature throat slashing and abdomen mutilations that were absent. Alice Mackenzie was murdered on July 17, 1889, in Castle Alley, Whitechapel. Her throat was slashed, and she had several abdominal wounds, leading some to suspect she was another Ripper victim. However, her injuries were less severe than those inflicted on the thought-to-be 5 confirmed victims, and the method of attack appeared to be less frenzied. Some investigators believed her murder was the work of a copycat, while others argued that the Ripper had returned after months of silence, but had lost some of his previous brutality. Ultimately, the police did not officially connect her murder to Jack the Ripper. These cases, as well as several others, remain controversial, with some theorists believing that the Ripper had more than 5 victims, while others argue that these murders were committed by different individuals. Despite lack of forensic advancements in 1888, investigators did uncover several clues that fueled speculation about Jack the Ripper's identity. While none led to a definitive answer, they remained central to the mystery. After the murder of Catherine Eddowes on September 30th, 1888, police discovered a piece of blood-stained apron in a doorway of Goulston Street, Whitechapel. This discovery was significant. It was the only physical clue linked to the killer. Above the apron, written in chalk, was a cryptic message. "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The meaning of the graffiti has been hotly debated for over a century. Some believe it was written by the killer, while others argue it was unrelated or simply coincidental. The wording itself has been transcribed in multiple variations, leading to further speculation about its true intent. The timing of the discovery was crucial. PC Alfred Long of the Metropolitan Police found the apron at 2:55 a.m., just hours after Eddowes' murder. Detective Constable Daniel Halls of City of London Police arrived shortly after and recorded a slightly different version of the graffiti. The presence of 2 separate police forces, the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police, complicated the investigation as jurisdictional tensions arose. Fearing anti-Semitic riots, Sir Charles Warren, Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, ordered the message to be erased before it could be photographed. This decision has been widely criticized as it removed a potential clue that could have helped investigators. Despite the darkness surrounding the Ripper's crimes, several eyewitnesses claim to have seen a suspicious man near the murder scenes, though their descriptions vary widely. On September 8, 1888, Elizabeth Long reported seeing Annie Chapman speaking with a man outside 29 Hanbury Street around 5:15 a.m., describing him as wearing a dark coat and brown deerstalker hat. Just 30 minutes later, Chapman was found murdered. On September 30th, Witnesses claim that they saw Elizabeth stride with a different man before her death. William Marshall overheard one say, "You would say anything but your prayers," while PC William Smith saw another carrying a parcel wrapped in newspaper. Miss Fanny Mortimer later reported seeing a man with a black bag, though he was later identified as an innocent passerby. And the same night, Joseph Lawton saw Elizabeth Eddowes speaking with a man in a dark coat and peaked cap near Mitre Square, but his description was too vague to lead to an arrest. On November 9th, Mary Ann Cox saw Mary Jane Kelly enter her room with a blotchy-faced man in a thick coat, while George Hutchinson later claimed to have seen her with a wealthy-looking man, describing him as an unusual detail, including a gold chain and dark mustache, a level of precision that made the police question his reliability. Despite these sightings, the inconsistency made it impossible to form a clear image of the killer. Some believe he had changed his appearance, while others suspected multiple individuals were responsible. The police faced immense challenges in narrowing down suspects in the Jack the Ripper case, given the lack of forensic science and the chaotic nature of Whitechapel. Investigators focused on individuals who had anatomical knowledge, and some victims had their organs removed with precision, leading to the theory that the killer could have been a doctor, butcher, or surgeon. They also examined known criminals, particularly those with histories of violence against women, and questioned local residents who may have had suspicious movements during the murders. Eyewitness accounts played a role, though descriptions varied, making it difficult to form a consistent profile. The police also considered social status, debating whether the murderer was a working-class laborer blending into Whitechapel streets, or a wealthy individual who traveled into the area to commit his crimes. Montague John Druitt was a barrister and schoolteacher whose mysterious death in December 1888 led some to suspect he was Jack the Ripper. Druitt came from an upper-middle-class background, studied at Oxford University, and worked as an assistant schoolmaster in Blackhurst while practicing law. However, in late November 1888, he was suddenly dismissed from his teaching position for reasons that remain unclear. A month later, on December 31, 1888, his body was found floating in the River Thames near Chadwick. The inquest determined that he had died by suicide, with a note found amongst his belongings stating, "Since Friday I felt I was going to be like Mother, and the best thing for me was to die." His mother had reportedly suffered from mental illnesses, leading some to speculate that Druitt may have experienced similar struggles. Druitt was later named as a favorable suspect by Melville McNaughton, Assistant Chief of Constable of the Metropolitan Police. In his 1894 memorandum, McNaughton described Druitt as a doctor of about 41 years of age, though he was actually 31, who disappeared after the Miller's Court murder and whose family suspected him of being the Whitechapel murderer. He also claimed that Druitt was sexually insane, though no evidence supports this assertion. The theory that Druitt was Jack the Ripper is extremely circumstantial. His suicide coincided the end of the murders, leading some to believe that he took his own life out of guilt. However, there is no direct evidence to link him to the crime, and many modern researchers dismiss him as an unlikely suspect. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish barber, has long been considered a prime suspect in the Jack the Ripper case. Born in 1865, Kosminski immigrated to London's East End, where he worked as a hairdresser in Whitechapel, the very district where the murders occurred. However, he suffered from severe mental illness, displaying paranoid behavior and experiencing auditory hallucinations. By 1891, he was institutionalized at Colony Hatch Lunatic Asylum, later transferred to Leavesdale Asylum, where he remained until he died in 1919. Kosminski was first named a suspect in 1894 by Melville Macnaughton, who described him as a Polish Jew with homicidal tendencies. Another senior officer, Robert Anderson, later claimed that a witness had identified Kosminski as the killer, but refused to testify, making it impossible to secure a conviction. In recent years, Kosminski's name has resurfaced due to DNA evidence allegedly linking him to the crimes. In 2014, researcher Yari Lulayan analyzed a Shaw found near Catherine Eddowes' body, claiming that genetic material came from Kosminski was present. In 2019, studies further supported this claim, but critics argue that the DNA testing lacked peer review and that the Shaw's provenance was questionable. It was never officially logged as evidence at the time of the murder. Despite the circumstantial evidence, Kosminski's mental instability and lack of physical proof leave his role in the murders uncertain. While some believe he was the true Ripper, others argue that he was merely a convenient scapegoat. The debate over his guilt continues, making him one of the most controversial suspects in this case. Walter Siggett, a renowned British artist, has also been a controversial suspect in the Jack the Ripper case, though many historians dismiss the theory entirely. Siggett was a painter known for his eerie, shadowy depictions of London's underbelly, and his fascination with crime led him to create works inspired by murders and violence. Some theorists believe this obsession went beyond art, suggesting that he may have been involved in the Ripper killings. The theory gained traction in 2002 when crime novelist Patricia Cornwell published Portrait of a Killer, Jack the Ripper, Case Closed, arguing that Siggett was the true murderer. She claimed that Siggett had been impotent due to childhood surgeries, which fueled the pathological hatred of women. Cornwell also analyzed the Ripper letters, assessing that forensic evidence linked them to Siggett. However, critics pointed out that the DNA testing was inconclusive, and many of the Ripper letters were likely to be hoaxes. Siggett's paintings have also been scrutinized, particularly his 1907 work, Jack the Ripper's Bedroom, which depicts a dark, ominous room. Some believe that his Camden Town murder series, inspired by the 1908 killing of Emily Dominic, bears similarities to the Ripper murder scenes. However, most art historians argue that Siggett was simply fascinated by crime, not involved in it. Despite the sensational claims, there is no concrete evidence linking Siggett to the murders. He was never a suspect during the original investigation, and many historians reject the idea entirely, viewing it as a modern speculation rather than a historical fact. Francis Tombletti, an Irish-born American doctor, has long been considered a possible suspect. Known for his eccentric personality and questionable medicine practices, Tombletti made a fortune posing as an Indian herb doctor, selling patients medicine across the United States and Canada. Tombletti had a deep-seated hatred for women, particularly those he deemed immoral, and was known to boast about keeping a collection of female reproductive organs in jars. His misogynistic views, combined with his medical background, led some to suspect that he could be the Ripper. In November of 1888, around the time of Mary Jane Kelly's murder, Tombletti was arrested in London on charges of gross indecency involving young men. While in custody, police reportedly investigated his possible connection to the Whitechapel murders. However, before they could thoroughly interrogate him, he jumped bail and fled to France, before eventually returning to the United States. Years later, Chief Inspector John Littlechild, head of the Metropolitan Police's Special Irish Branch, called Tombletti a likely suspect, stating that after his escape, the murders ceased. However, contrary to Littlechild's belief that Tombletti disappeared or committed suicide, he was later found living in St. Louis, Missouri, where he continued his medical practice until his death in 1903.
Despite circumstantial evidence, there's no direct proof linking Tom Bleddy to the murders. His flight from London remains suspicious, though many historians argue that his criminal record and eccentric behavior does not necessarily make him the Ripper. Thomas Cutbush was a violent and mentally unstable man who was institutionalized after the Jack the Ripper murders, leading some to suspect that he was the true killer. Born in 1866, Cutbush came from a middle-class family in Kensington, but his life was marked by erratic behavior and paranoia. He became obsessed with medical books, convinced that he was being poisoned, and frequently wandered the streets of Whitechapel at night. In 1891, Cutbush was arrested for stabbing 2 women in the streets, attacking them without warning. His violent tendencies led to his indefinite confinement at Broadmoor Hospital, where he remained until his death in 1903. The theory that Cutbush was Jack the Ripper gained traction in 1894 when the Sun newspaper published a series of articles claiming that he was the infamous killer. The report suggested that Cutbush had contracted syphilis from prostitutes, which fueled his hatred of women and led him to commit the Whitechapel murders. However, Melvick McNaughton, Assistant Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police, dismissed the theory, arguing that Cutbush was not the Ripper and named 3 other suspects: Montague Truitt, Michael Ostrog, and Aaron Kosminski, as more likely candidates. Despite the media attention, Cutbush was never officially charged with the Ripper murders, and modern researchers largely dismiss him as a suspect. His violent history and institutionalization made him an intriguing figure, but there's no direct evidence linking him to the crimes. These suspects are among the most frequently discussed in connection with Jack the Ripper. However, they are far from the only ones. Over the years, numerous other individuals have been proposed as potential culprits, including Prince Albert Victor, Dr. Neil Cream, James Maybrick, Michael Ostrog, Robert Donston, and even H.H. Holmes, the infamous American serial killer. Then there are those who argue that the idea of Jack the Ripper as a singular killer may be incorrect, suggesting that the Whitechapel murders were committed by multiple individuals rather than one elusive figure. This theory challenges the traditional narrative and raises questions about whether the canonical 5 victims were truly linked to a single perpetrator. One of the strongest arguments for multiple killers is the variation in the murders. While the canonical 5 victims all suffered throat slashes and abdominal mutilations, the extent of the injuries varied significantly. Elizabeth Stride, for example, was found with only 1 single throat wound and no mutilations, leading some to believe she was killed by someone other than the Ripper. Similarly, Mary Jane Kelly's murder was far more extensive and brutal than the others, suggesting a different level of violence, or even a different killer altogether. Some theorists propose that the murders were committed by multiple individuals working together, possibly as part of a gang or secret society. This idea stems from the brutality of the killings, which some believe could indicate ritualistic or organized violence rather than the work of one lone serial killer. A private investigator once suggested that the 3 men connected to the International Working Men's Educational Club may have been responsible, citing violent tendencies and political movements. Another possibility is that some murders were committed by a copycat killer. The media frenzy surrounding the cases may have inspired other violent individuals to mimic the crimes, leading to similar but distinct murders. This could explain why some victims had different wound patterns, or why certain killings appeared less frenzied than others. Some historians argue that the police and newspapers may have grouped unrelated murders together under the Jack the Ripper name to create a cohesive narrative. Whitechapel was a dangerous area, and the violent deaths were not uncommon. It's possible that some murders were wrongly attributed to Jack the Ripper simply because they fit a general pattern of female victims killed in the streets. While the single killer theory remains the most widely accepted, the idea of multiple murderers continues to intrigue researchers. The difference in crime scenes, the possibility of gang involvement, and the influence of media and police narratives all contribute to the debate. Whether Jack the Ripper was one man or several, the mystery remains one of the most enduring and debated cases in criminal history. When we think of Jack the Ripper, we instinctively picture a male predator lurking in the shadows of Whitechapel. But what if our understanding of serial killers is shaped by deeply rooted biases? Could the infamous murderer have been a woman, moving through the streets unnoticed, escaping suspicion simply because society wasn't looking for her? The Jill the Ripper theory suggests that the infamous Whitechapel murderer may have been a woman, rather than the traditionally assumed male killer. The idea was first proposed by Dr. Frederick Alberline, who suspected that a female murderer could have moved through Whitechapel without suspicion, especially if she were a midwife or a nurse. One of the strongest arguments for this theory is that a midwife could have had the anatomical knowledge, allowing her to carry out the precise organ removal seen in some of the Ripper murders. Additionally, a midwife covered in blood would not have raised alarm, as it was common for them to assist in childbirth and medical procedures. Another factor fueling this theory is the testimony of Caroline Maxwell, who claimed to have seen Mary Jane Kelly alive hours before she was supposedly murdered. Some theorists suggest that the killer may have worn Kelly's clothes to escape unnoticed, further supporting the idea that the murderer could have been a woman. One suspect often linked to this theory is Mary Pursey, who was convicted in 1890 for the brutal murder of her lover's wife and child. Her crime bore similarities to the Ripper killings, leading some to speculate that she could have been the true culprit. Throughout history, the mystery of Jack the Ripper has captivated minds, sparking endless speculation and debate. We have explored the victims, suspects, clues, and theories, each piece of evidence offering a glimpse into the chilling shadow that overcast Whitechapel, London in 1888. Yet despite all of the investigations, the truth remains just out of reach, lost to time and hidden within the fog of history. Adding to the mystery is the loss and theft of critical information and evidence over the years. Some items, such as the Galston Street graffiti, were deliberately erased, while others, like crime scene artifacts, were either misplaced, stolen, or destroyed. Even the infamous Eddowes shawl, which was later tested for DNA, has been heavily debated, with questions surrounding its authenticity and chain of custody. Recently, previously unseen case files from Inspector Joseph Henry Hilson were released, shedding new light on the investigation, but also highlighting how much evidence has been lost to history. Perhaps what makes this case so withstanding, the idea that we never truly will know the identity of the infamous murderer. But history is not just about answers. It's about discovery, exploration, and understanding the world that came before us. The past guides us, teaches us, and reminds us that even in the darkest moments, there are stories to be told and lessons to be learned. So, as we step away from the gaslit streets of Victorian London, let us continue to seek out the truth, question what we think we know, and let the mysteries guide us while history lights our path. This is Amanda Joy, signing off.